Hello everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Didier Boyer. I am French, I live in Paris, but I've lived in Japan and trained in Aikido at Hombu for 40 years. I discovered Aikido early in the 70s. Actually, probably, I don't quite remember, but I think it was 1972 that I saw a documentary on French television showing Japanese martial arts, generally speaking, and in particular Aikido. So this is when I discovered it, and I saw images of O-sensei, images of Dojo Kishomaru, and I was under shock immediately. So I looked for a dojo in the small city where I was living, and I met the teacher who was instructing in that dojo, who had been a Nakazono sensei in the 60s, and who was at that time following Tamura sensei, who was living in France since the mid-60s. So basically he was my first teacher, of course, but it took me very, very quickly to Tamura sensei, and I started to follow Tamura sensei around. Tamura sensei at that time didn't have a dojo. He was the head of the French Federation of Aikido, and he was basically moving around every weekend. He was somewhere teaching someplace, so it was easy to see him pretty much a couple of times a month. And then a few months later, maybe a couple of years later, I got to meet Chiba sensei, who at that time was living in England, where he was teaching Aikido in London at that time. He was coming to France, invited by Tamura sensei, and he would teach also seminars as well as summer camps. And years went by, and in 1976, Chiba sensei went back to Japan to work at Hombu. And in 1977, a year later, I also met a Yaido teacher called Mitsuzuka Takeshi, who came to France to teach Yaido summer camp. I was under the spell of this teacher, so as soon as he went back to Japan in September of that year, I decided to follow and go to Hombu and practice Aikido. So I had a meeting with Chiba sensei in September, and I informed him that I was going to move to Japan for my first idea was a couple of years. And I arrived in Tokyo in October of 1977. And in fact, I was stayed there for 40 years until June of 2016. I was quite lucky because for a couple of reasons. The first one being that Chiba sensei was my sponsor at Hombu Dojo. So he signed me up, introduced me to Doshu, introduced me to all the great teachers who were teaching then. And he took me under his wings, sort of, until he left a few years later. He left for America. Anyway, so this, the second big chance that I had when I went to Japan was that all the great teachers of the post-war great teachers were around, alive and kicking. So, of course, Kishomaru Doshu, but also Osawa sensei, senior, Yamaguchi sensei, Arikawa sensei, Tada sensei, just to name a few. I mean, they were all there, they were all teaching. And it was Christmas every day. All you had to do is go to the dojo, and you had every day, whatever the time, a great teacher, 5 hours a day. This is what I did. Practicing every day, as many hours as I could. And on top of it, practicing Yaido, Muso Shinden Ryo Yaido with Mitsuzuka sensei at the police station of Yotsuya in Shinjuku, where we were practicing on Wednesday, Saturday, Sundays, all day, Saturdays and Sundays. Great teaching. So, big luck. On top of it, there was a group, there were quite a number of foreigners at that time, training at Hombu, and there was a group made up American, English, and that's about it. I think American and English, and they were taking private lessons with Chiba Sensei, and they let me join the group. So I started to practice with this group on Tuesdays and Thursdays, doing privately lessons with Chiba Sensei, mostly Aikido, but also a lot of Boken at that time. The luck was that maybe training was a little bit different at that time than it is nowadays, in the sense that most of the students that have become teachers at Hombu now never met even Kishomaru Dojo, let alone O-sensei. I never met O-sensei myself, of course, because when I arrived in Japan, he had passed almost 10 years. So, but I was lucky enough to train with Kishomaru Dojo. But most of the young teachers nowadays I haven't seen or trained, of course, with Kishomaru Dojo. So it's a little bit, it's not a problem, but it's quite different from what it was, let's say 30 years ago or 25 years ago. But at that time, there were also some really good young teachers. I mean, people like Shibata, Seki, Yasuno. These guys had been training in the 60s, the early 70s, but mostly the 60s. And they were really good, and strong, and very, very dedicated. They didn't have much work in terms of administration or work outside, teaching outside Hombu Dojo, not that much. So they were available for most of the classes. They would be there in the morning, in the evening. So it was great. Then the deshis at that time, also in the 70s, were very nice. Miyamoto Sensei, Osawa, Yokota Sensei, and then Kuribayashi, Kobayashi, and so on. So great time, great training. But after 40 years, I was getting old, and my wife, who was teaching at university, she was teaching French literature in university, also retired, and thought that maybe it would be a good idea to move back to France, which is what we did after, as I said, 40 years in Japan. It was a bit harsh to leave Japan, but then, on the other hand, it was a big move. And there is a time in your life when things are becoming difficult, physically speaking. So it was maybe a good idea to get back at that time. Unfortunately, now we have a big problem with this pandemic situation. Here in Paris, everything is closed. It reopened a little bit in last August for a few weeks, and apparently a second wave of the virus activity, so the government decided to close every public places, including bars. Restaurants are partly closed, but all gymnasium, dojo, places where the public usually gather for activities are closed for the for the end of the month of October. We'll see by then. Right, so see the cat. Very interesting. Winter is coming, so he likes to be on the knees where it's warm. Going back to the Hombu Dojo life, my main teacher for all these years was Chiba Sensei. So although he left Japan in the early 80s, he moved to America and settled in California in 1982. I kept visiting him on a regular basis every year, a couple or 3 times a year, to train in his dojo and then just to visit him. They were great teachers in Hombu until the end of the year 90s, the late 90s, where unfortunately they started to disappear one after the other. Starting with the Dojo and then Yamaguchi Sensei, or starting with Yamaguchi Sensei and then Dojo, Osawa Sensei, and so on. So it was sad seeing all these great people disappearing. But I was lucky enough to practice with them for almost 30 years, sometimes a little bit more. Still, I mean, if people have a chance today to go to Hombu and practice, take it, go and practice, because you have a chance to do and train Aikido for 5 hours a day, every day. It's a unique chance. The dojo is always open. There is always somebody you can practice with. There is always somebody that can push you up or down, so which helps you get back on your feet and move on. So I would recommend it. If you have a chance, go to Hombu and practice. That's about it. For my story, you can check my website if you want more information, and you'll see images and stories. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.